encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. Conversations about life, Christianity, and culture. Welcome into Four Preachers and a Podcast from Henderson, Tennessee. I'm Robert Hatfield. From Moulton, Alabama, there's Brad McNutt. What's going on, Brad?
Not much, Mr. Bean.
And from Charleston, South Carolina, it's Chance Hicks. Hey,
Hello.
Chance.
How are you guys today?
We're doing well. And our fearless leader.
In a great mood.
Thank you. Yes. And our fearless leader from Bowling Green, Kentucky, Hiram Kemp. What's up, Hiram?
What's up? The only thing Hiram is thinking right now is, why did I agree to do a podcast with three white people?
If you're listening and you're not watching the video, my video up until now has just been a still image of a Mr. Bean toy that I have in my office, just sitting on a shelf. And that's what I'm gonna contribute to today's episode. We're looking forward to this. Welcome in season 2, episode 2. More on that in just a second. First, though, let us remind you of the Light Network Conference coming up September 1st through 3rd, during which we will be on our best behavior.
Questionable.
We want you to come join us in Henderson, Tennessee, September 1st through the 3rd. That's Labor Day weekend, just 23 days from when we're recording this, but you're not going to hear it for another, 10 days. So it's getting close, people. Go and register now, thelightnetwork.tv/conference. It's free to attend. We want you to come and be a part of it. You can register at that website. You can also see the complete schedule. We want you to come be a part of this. We've got people from all over the place who are going to be joining us, and we're looking forward to hosting you all. So come and see us. 10th anniversary Light Network Conference. It's the first one of those, but it's in honor of our 10th anniversary. You know what I'm saying. Hiram, take it away.
It's going to be lit.
I'll be over here.
So today's episode, we're talking about tragedy and how Christians respond to tragedy, and what should we do as people of God when tragedy strikes in our world and our community around us. And I thought it'd be best first to just define what we mean by tragedy. Tragedy is an event that causes suffering, great destruction, suffering, distress, or any serious accident, crime, or natural catastrophe. And so that's a broad definition. It encompasses a wide variety of things, but we're just going to talk today about what Christians should do and maybe even shouldn't do when those things happen. So I guess the first question is, as our news cycle and 24-hour information age constantly updates us on every tragedy in every city all around the world, how do we as Christians avoid the two extremes of either, on the one hand, owning every tragedy, feeling like we just have to respond to everything and everything's our burden to bear, versus the other extreme, we could say, of just completely ignoring things, putting our head in the sand and saying, hey, my life's going great. Things are going good for me. Don't have time for anybody else's stuff. Or I'm in my own state of tragedy, and so I don't really have any sorrow to contribute to anybody else's. How do we balance that sort of thing? I guess I'll start with you, Chance. You're the most, I trust you the most. Right
Oh, boy. Look at that.
You're the most tragic among us. Chance, go ahead.
Apparently, yes. You look like tragedy right now. How are you handling that?
How are you handling it?
I don't know. That's a difficult question to think about. How do you balance that? Because, you want to be aware of what's happening in the world. You want to be aware of what's happening in your community and how people are processing that. Because, in our culture, people are receiving news and information from everywhere. And so you think about, I guess, from the standpoint of preaching and ministry, even though it may be a tragedy on the other side of the world that doesn't directly impact our people and our congregations, they're exposed to that. They're listening to that news. They're watching it. And so it's having an impact on them. And they're going to want potentially some aid, some help, some kind of direction as what they need to be doing as God's people in response to it. So in response to any tragedy, some form of feeling along with those people, putting yourselves into that situation to try to feel along with them, and then approaching God in prayer in response to that. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but you put me on the spot, so there you go.
All right. What else do we got? What do y'all think? How do we balance those ideas of, again, I think Chance is right, and prayer is probably a key component to this. Well, it is, because we aren't God. And so it's true that we need to be concerned and care, but we do far more than we could otherwise when we first just bow our heads and pray and ask God to be with people everywhere that are suffering in any way. And that's better than anything we could physically muster up and do, but also not being completely checked out and being aloof to things just because we feel like, well, that doesn't directly involve me.
I think that's the challenge of an information age, don't you? I mean,
Yeah.
you can't. That's what I'm struggling to figure out how to put into words. Like, I want to use words like triage, or, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
you almost have, you can't fully take on everything that's going on all across the world, but at the same time, you can't fully check out from anything that's going on anywhere in the world, including your doorstep. And we were talking before the show, and I think, Hiram, you mentioned a minute ago too, like sometimes we're living in our own personal tragedy. You know, a tragedy can be global, or it can be national, or it can be statewide, or it can be local, or it can be right here in my life or in my home. And, you know, the response to that may vary. I'm thinking about, like, Jesus was compassionate. You know, we know that he was, but at the same time, he wasn't running around healing every person or preventing every tragedy. And so I'm just thinking, like, from a practical perspective, we have to be people of compassion. And maybe if we hear that something's going on, and let's say we have boots on the ground somewhere, like maybe our congregation supports a missionary in Haiti, and they've just gone through another earthquake or something like that. Or let's say that we have a tie to a congregation in Ukraine, and, you know, they're dealing with what they're dealing with over there right now and have been now for quite some time. Is there some way that we can do something, you know, directly to help them in addition to prayer? I think, you know, this pray without ceasing thing, 1 Thessalonians 5, like, I wonder whether we do sort of get numb to it just because of the news cycle, and whether you watch the news or not. I mean, like, my phone is always popping up headlines, and I keep that turned on because I think that's important for me to see. And sometimes the headlines make sense to me, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes I have to go read the story. But I guess that all that to say, like, that's why I'm kind of saying triage. So, like, maybe there are some things that I don't really know a lot about, but eventually I'll see, like, Churches of Christ Disaster Relief is sending aid to this place or that place, and through my local congregation, I can contribute to support that. Okay, I haven't done a lot. Maybe I've prayed. Maybe I've sent a check. Maybe there's an opportunity for me to go. Like, about a year ago, there were some really bad storms and flooding and things like that over here in West Tennessee. And so there are opportunities that people had to go. Or less than a year ago, there were some bad tornadoes down in Mississippi. That's not that far away from us. And so we were able to, you know, get boots on the ground there. But so we can't close up our hearts, but at the same time, you can't take on everything equally. And I think that's a challenge that we're experiencing in an information age like ours.
Yeah, I think to circle back around, I'm ready to say something better now, maybe.
We'll take it.
But I think Robert's right. Like, so I think, you know, you should approach any tragedy that you learn about from the standpoint of a prayerful posture of approaching God on behalf of those people. And then if further doors open that bring that tragedy closer to home, or a tragedy that opens a door that allows for further interaction, then those are the ones you respond to in a more direct way. So you shoulder you shoulder them all in a way in your prayer life, but then you shoulder the ones that really come close to your doorstep in a different way, where you also are prayerful about them, but then you look for opportunities to step in and minister and help, whether that is in a congregational way or an individual way, as you have the opportunity.
Yeah, and I think we see Jesus doing some of that. Jesus was present with the people that were suffering right in front of him. He would deal with those. He knew of hurting all around the world and could have addressed all of those if he wanted to, but he focused on what was right in front of him. And we're wise when we do that. And also remembering, and prayer helps with this, God has people all over the world. So part of our prayer should be, God, help your people who are closest to this event to rise up and be the people that they need to be. Not to say, as was mentioned, we can't send aid or help financially and all of that, but God's not depending on us to be Superman or woman and be in every place at every time. And that's what I mean by owning every tragedy, because sometimes we want to do those things and we'll neglect the hardship right in front of us. So I just think there's some wisdom in praying that God basically dispatch his servants to do what they should in the immediate context where they live, while also not neglecting to pray and be concerned about individuals there, but just realizing, don't fall into the Elijah complex. I'm the only one left. What's going to happen if I don't do it? Because God has people all over the world who are serving him and willing to do his will. Brad, you got something on this?
Ditto. I mean, really, that's it. Keeping in mind, no matter what the tragedy is, even if it is at your doorstep, which I think plays into this, what we're talking about, what I'm going to say is, remember that there is a savior of the world and you're not it. You're not him. We don't have to play savior. We serve. We come alongside people and we serve in whatever way, in whatever capacity. But let Jesus be Jesus, and let us do what he's called us to do wherever we find that tragedy to be. And as Robert said, if we have a connection to it, that's great. If not, we can't fix everything. So it's a tough balance.
Yeah, and I think there's a principle in 2 Corinthians. Paul's talking to the folks in Achaia about giving for the hardship going on in the area of Judea. And in 2 Corinthians 8, he's talking especially about financial contribution. But in verse 12, I believe he says something like, giving is according to what a person has, not according to what they don't have. And that's true financially, but it's also true just about stewardship, time, accessibility. God's going to hold us accountable and expects us to be engaged with what we have, not with what we don't have. He knows what we can do. He knows what we can't do. And we need to, again, when we can serve, not use excuses or just be so self-absorbed that we're detached, but also, as Brad mentioned, not have a savior complex. So sort of switching gears here, something else that often comes up in tragedy when folks are suffering or when they experience suffering, there can be this response from the unbelieving world that says, how could a good God exist? I know this is an age-old question, but it often comes up. How could a good and loving God exist, all-powerful God, if this kind of suffering exists in the world? Or even people that are faithful Christians sometimes suffering and then struggling with their faith in response, saying things like, I really prayed. And I've heard Christians say things like, if I were more righteous, maybe God would have heard and delivered or answered this prayer or something along those lines. And so how do we talk to people about the goodness of God in tragedy? And does suffering and tragedy and hardship remove? I know what we're going to say to this, but how do we get people to see that that doesn't nullify God's existence or his goodness and involvement in the world? What do we say to people that are suffering in that way?
Well, I think initially when people are suffering and they're asking questions, I don't really say a lot. Sometimes that's just frustration. It's emotions all over the place. It's anger. Later on, if they want to have that discussion, I'm all for it. But I think some of that misunderstanding comes from a health and wealth mentality of the gospel, that God promised me that I was going to be free of pain. And that's a completely inaccurate picture of what the New Testament, or all of the Bible says. And that is, God does not promise us a life free of pain. He promises us we will never walk through pain alone. And he will take that pain and he can flip it and turn it and do things with it that we can't do on our own. And so when we're dealing with that, how can a loving God allow this? We need to first deal with the underlying presupposition. I'm assuming that God in my life protects me from every evil thing, and that's just not true.
Yeah, you think about Joseph in the Old Testament. One of the statements that's made about Joseph regularly is that the Lord was with him, but the Lord being with him did not prevent him from false accusations being cast against him, and those false accusations then leading to his suffering in prison and that tragedy that came into his life. yet the Lord was with him through it all. And so the same is true today. Like the Lord is with his people, but that doesn't mean as his people we won't face some of the tragedies and sufferings that happen just because we live on this earth and in this world.
Yeah, I think that. Go ahead, Robert.
I was just going to say, I think, Jesus says the sun rises and shines on the just and the unjust. Well, the storms come on the just and the unjust as well. And, Jesus's point in that context was God blesses everybody, and that's the truth. But God will bless everyone even in the midst of the difficulty. If as a Christian you're going through a tragedy and you find that God has answered no to your plea for relief, it doesn't help really anything, but it's just a fact that you're in good company. I mean, Paul prayed about the thorn in the flesh 3 times. The answer was no. The response was, my grace is sufficient for you. There's something in this. I'm not saying that God sent it, but there's something in this that can draw you closer to him and help you to learn to trust him more. And, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed 3 times. The answer was no. Now, obviously, that was fulfilling a greater purpose, a purpose to the point that's already been made, right? You're not the Savior, a purpose that you don't have. But at the same time, if God told his only son no, and that because of the consequences of a fallen world, if I can speak broadly for a moment, then, God will tell you and me no, or God will allow us to go through difficulty. Once again, a consequence of living in a fallen world. And I appreciate the point that's already been made. God didn't promise a life of ease. He did promise, though, his presence, his providence, his people who will help us and take care of us. And so through all of that, I agree too, the initial thought of sometimes, people aren't ready to hear that kind of message. I think that if you're in a support role, if you can have a calm and a peace about you in the midst of walking through tragedy with someone else, this is especially hard if it's a tragedy that's more on a community level rather than on a personal level. But if you can have a peace about you, not a cockiness, not a y'all quit freaking out kind of attitude, but instead just we're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. And some people are ready to hear that at times, and some people aren't. But if you can somehow, whether audibly or inaudibly, communicate, God is going to get us through this, because he will. And sometimes you'll need to tell yourself that until you actually believe it again, or until you know it. But, I believe in sort of leading with your best foot forward. And I think that that's the way to do that in the midst of tragedy. So, God will see us through. That way, when he does, we're ready to accept that, and we're ready to credit him with having done so. And then, for now, we're just going to put one foot in front of the other and do the best that we can.
Yeah, and I think the incarnation and Calvary helps us with this thought, right? How do we know of a loving God? Well, he entered into the world and he put himself into a place of suffering and tragedy, and he experienced it personally. And then he Isaiah says he's the man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And so there's no one who understands and knows suffering and tragedy better than our God, and Jesus, who experienced that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I heard Tim Keller say one time in response to the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew 26, that Robert mentioned a moment ago, that Jesus is praying. He's begging God, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Events aren't changed. Jesus goes through suffering. And Keller's response was, if he didn't abandon you in his greatest hour of suffering, what makes you think he'll abandon you in yours? And so if he was willing to go through his greatest hour of suffering, as Chance mentioned, the cross for your sake and for my sake, don't think for a second that in your greatest hour of trial, he'll abandon you. And so I think we need to just remember the presence of God is better than a trial-free life. I think we would probably want it the other way, but Paul eventually gets to the point in 2 Corinthians 12 when he says, I would rather have a thorn-filled, God present with me life than a thorn-free and God absent life. And we might think one of those is better than the other, but Paul's saying choose wisely. God's presence in hardship is better than a life absent with hardship and God's presence. Does what y'all said change at all if you're talking to somebody who's not a Christian, like an atheist? And I'm not talking about in the moment of their tragedy. I'm just talking about in maybe a conversation, an apologetic type discussion, one-on-one with somebody who says, here's why I can't believe in God. Look at these atrocities that happen in general throughout the world or throughout history. Does what you say change because this person is saying God can't exist or he can't be good? Because look at what goes on in people's lives all around the world.
I would say the answer definitely does change. I mean, you do have to deal with some presuppositions and some things that are going on. Um, but here's the thing we have to keep in mind too: we all have our worldviews, and so what's interesting is many people want to come after Christianity and say, "What about sin, suffering, and violence?" Well, here's the thing: not only does the Christian worldview have to answer that, every worldview has to answer that. And you need to go and look at what I believe we have solid Christian responses to sin, suffering, and violence and tragedy and all those types of different things. But if you look at the response of the other world religions, I mean, where are you going to go? Who is going to, I mean, the Bible does not avoid this. It leans right into it head on, and God says, I'm going to right every wrong. And so the fact that it somehow suffering would disprove a good and a caring God, it just doesn't hold up. First of all, if you put all worldviews in that same category, you're going to run into an issue. Even if you reject God, okay, well then I went through all of this for what? For nothing. What about Romans 8, where God says, I'm going to take this and I'm going to flip this. I'm going to write this. Christianity gives meaning to your suffering. And it's not just I'm just molecules that are floating out here. Where are you going to?
Yeah, without God, if you say, well, God doesn't exist because of hardship, you don't remove the hardship. You just remove the possibility that it has any meaning or purpose and that you can redeem it for anything good. And so saying that God doesn't exist because there's suffering in the world still leaves you with suffering, but now it's just pointless, just masochist type pain that you don't really get any benefit from, or you can't say, well, this suffering leads to that. And Christianity does infuse meaning into suffering, and not that God causes it or brings it, but that God is powerful enough to bring good out of it. And I think people need to hear that, because sometimes our view of a good God is really more about just everything going our way. But the point of scripture is that God binds up the wounds of the brokenhearted, that God enters into human suffering, and through that is able to bring about good. And a lot of times we can only see that in hindsight. You think about Joseph's life, and in retrospect, at the end in Genesis 50, he says, okay, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And that's not to say every tragedy has this Joseph type redemptive aspect to it, but it just does say we are not in the best position as we currently live out our lives in live footage, to judge every circumstance and why everything happens. And a little humility and tragedy would be good for humanity, just to accept that we don't know everything. So what do we say about the biblical genre of lament? How does that play into this discussion at all? I know the Bible, there's a whole book in the Bible, Lamentations, and in ancient Near Eastern culture, this was a important idea. We don't really study the book of Lamentations a lot or talk about it, but it'd be helpful for us to think about this. We've said in several answers so far that in the Bible it addresses this issue, and I think the book of Lamentations and a few other passages helps us as Christians to learn how to do this as the people of God. I mean, you think about Jesus in John 11 coming to the grave of Lazarus. He's coming because he knows what he's going to do. I mean, he knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. That's the reason he came, and yet he still was able to have a spirit of lament, and Jesus weeps in John 11:35. And so how do we basically recover that attitude in our current climate and culture and be the people of lament sometimes when tragedy strikes? You think about Job's friends and how they responded to Job. Initially, their response was good. It was one of lament, but eventually they opened their mouths and things went wild. So
I think there is, just in my experience, there is a common belief that many people have, and of Christians that I've interacted with, They say, I'm just so angry, and they feel like they're wrong for being angry.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I tell them is, you have every right in the world to be angry. And I think I can argue from John chapter 11 that God is angry at it.
Mm.
I mean, what is he doing if he is not getting angry at death in John chapter 11 and the suffering that it brings into the world? I don't understand what's going on if that's not what's happening. And so lamentation shows us that anger, frustration, fear, all of it is okay. But take it to someone who can do something with it. Take it to God and pour it out in front of him. And I think that's what lamentation is really about. It's about taking all of those things and saying, I've been wronged, or something happened to me. And as I've often said many times when we're dealing with death, people say, we have accepted death as a way of life. Basically, people die, and that's just a fact. But Jesus refuses to accept that. That's why there's going to be a resurrection. He will not let it have the last word. He refuses it. And so having these emotions and lamentation, I think we see them embodied in Jesus. I think we see them in tons of Psalms. And as you've already said, the Lamentations. And I think that's an important thing. They help us realize it's okay to have bad days and raw emotions, but take them to God.
Yeah. Isn't it safe to say that the spirit of lamentation, the ability to weep with those that weep, is further proof that God loves us and that he gives us an outlet of expression in those times of hardship and in those times of difficulty? God cares enough about us to say, hey, I know you're frustrated. The book of Psalms teaches you how to pray those frustrations. And as one of my professors often said in those sections, God is big enough to handle your frustrations and problems when you're upset. And we need to appreciate that about God, always with reverence, always with respect, but even being mad at God about certain things in a certain way. The psalmist prayed those frustrations to God. Now, they often end on a note of praise, realizing that he is the divine deliverer, but God expects humans to have this spirit of anger, disappointment, and just angst at things going on in the world. And it is a proper biblical response. Jesus doesn't come and rebuke Martha and Mary for being sad or discouraged at the death of Lazarus. He comes and infuses hope into the situation. We tell people when they're suffering and crying all the time, be strong and don't cry, as if to say, crying makes you weak, as if to say, if you had more spiritual vigor and maturity, you wouldn't feel that way. But say that to Jesus in John 11:35. Exactly. Like say that to Jeremiah, or even to Paul, who often was weeping. It's not the case to say that stifled and suppressed emotion is a sign of spiritual strength. It may be the opposite. Right. And we've got to learn how to let people express that in times of grief and tragedy, which I think are kind of two sides of the same coin, pretty much.
Well, and it's certainly not helpful. I mean, it's unhealthy. And I mean, with spiritual stuff aside, I mean, who gave you these emotions? And I'm not, we've got to think about all this. You can't always trust your emotions. Blah blah blah. Insert caveat here. You know what I mean? But who gave you those? Like, where did those come from? Why do we think that as Christians we cannot express those in some way? And why do we think that when we're praying, we already have to have it figured out? Like we have to tell God the answer that we've figured out and like show our work. This isn't a math problem. I hated those word problems. Man, those are the worst.
Train was moving 50 miles. I'm not on the train.
I don't care about it. I never have ridden a train. Why do I care? I never need to know this information.
They'll tell me on my app what time I'm supposed to be there.
That's exactly right. I'm about to write a psalm of lament right now over word problems. But anyway, but like what I love about especially Psalms of Lament, and I know sometimes, depending on what scholar you read, it can be difficult to categorize the Psalms, blah, blah, blah. What I love, though, and like Psalm 10 is a good example. I happen to have it pulled up here. Like, why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Okay, this guy, he doesn't mind just saying exactly what's on his heart. And in fact, 3 times in the 10th Psalm, he asks the 3-letter question, why? You find it in verse 1 twice, and then you find it again in verse 13 when he says, why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you will not call to account? All right, 3 times the question is asked. It's answered a grand total of 0 times. That's great. All right, just like in Job. There's never a time in the 10th Psalm where God explains himself, nor is there a time when the psalmist answers the question on behalf of God. He just merely expresses what he's feeling, even though that's raw. And I'm just thinking, like, as Christians, we need to adopt this practice of lament, which includes weeping with those who weep. And maybe that's the extent of it when you're trying just to walk alongside someone who is in tragedy. I'm not saying that you adopt their tragedy and then offer a lament on their behalf. That's not what I'm saying at all. Although in praying with someone, you might express some of their frustrations.
Exactly.
Sure. But when you're dealing with something that's personal, or when you're trying to make sense of the world, right now, because of, some movies that are out, there's a lot of conversation about child trafficking. Okay, well, I got a lot of questions about that, and at the top of the list is why, and why is God allowing this to happen? That is a tragedy. I don't have an answer for that. I know that God isn't for it. I know that the people who are perpetrating this mess are going to have to answer for this one day, and it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, right? I understand all of that, but at the same time, all I can do is sit here and ask why. But what I also love about the psalmist and Psalms of Lament in general, and Lamentation in general, is he also comes around and says, but I know better than what my questions are implying. So when you come down to verse 13, when he says, why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you shall not call to account? He says this in verse 14, but you do see, you note mischief and vexation, that you may take it into your hands. To you, the helpless commits himself. You've been the helper of the fatherless. Wait a minute. Okay. It's like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. That's because he is. On one hand, he says, why? I don't understand this. On the other side, he says, but God, I know you, and I know that you don't want this, and I know that ultimately vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So all I can do is say, okay, on the one hand, God, why? Why do you act like you're not here? But on the other side, God, I know you are here. And it's not wrong to pray a prayer like that. Like, that's one of the things that this kind of psalm teaches me. It's okay to pray that kind of prayer. And I think sometimes we need to, and maybe we do, but we feel guilty about it. Or maybe we get this impression from like preacher stories that we're just supposed to already have it all together when the moment that tragedy strikes. But like, it's okay to pray a prayer like this. But the biggest thing, and I think the thing that makes lamentation as a biblical genre what it is this fact that he comes back around at the end and expresses trust and praise. He says, God, I don't know how you're going to solve this, but I know that you've got this. At least I know you've got me in the midst of this, and so you're going to help me through it. And that's why I think lamentation is so important, and I don't really know why we don't give it the emphasis that we should.
Yeah, and I think, Robert, you're right that biblical lamentation is not a spiritual temper tantrum apart from the presence of God.
Yeah.
It's about trusting, as you mentioned in the end, and hope. Habakkuk is a good case study of this. He's angry and frustrated, and God says, I'm going to do something about it. Then he's like, I don't like what you're going to do about it. And then God says, I'm going to do something about that too. And then Habakkuk says, I should probably be quiet and let you do God stuff, because you've been doing it a lot longer than I've been thinking about it. And
I like
that's
the HKV, Hiram Kemp version.
Well, I mean, I wrote my thesis on Habakkuk. I just make it up as I go. But here's the deal. That's how it ends, though. Same thing with Job. Job is frustrated, a lot of questions. But when God shows up, God gave Job something better than answers. He gave him himself, his presence. And that's what Job needed most. But that idea of lamentation says, and even Job throughout, there are times when it's like, is Job an atheist? And then there are times where it's like, oh, Job still hopes. Job sees that God's going to bring him through in the end. And as you mentioned, there's just this back and forth of tension that goes on. But biblical lamentation always maintains hope and trust because of who one's hope is in.
Just one more thing. It's my conviction in Philippians 4, where Paul says, don't be anxious about anything. When in verse 7, he says, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding. It's my conviction that surpasses all understanding is basically saying God's peace is better than your understanding of this situation that is causing anxiety. I think maybe the traditional interpretation, at least the one that I had growing up, was God's peace is beyond what I can comprehend. I don't doubt that that is true. I just wonder whether, and the reason why is because you do a word study of it sometimes, surpasses is used at least, I think, 2 other times in Philippians. And every time it means, for example, in Philippians 3, Jesus, the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. All right, yes, Christ Jesus is beyond what any human can fully get his mind around. But the point in context in Philippians 3 is Jesus is better than anything else. All right, so what if the peace that comes from God is better than having all the answers to my difficulties right now? And I think that tracks with the thorn in the flesh thing in 2 Corinthians 12, and with Habakkuk and with Job, to the point, Aaron, that you just made, and with the psalmist here in Psalm 10 and other passages as well. So just wanted to throw that out there for somebody to chew on sometime.
I'm glad you did. I've stolen that from you and used it in sermons. You taught me a lot of things. That might be the coolest thing. I think that is the right interpretation. Seriously,
It's the coolest thing.
I think that makes a lot of sense of what Paul's driving at. So you think about suffering, you think about good responses, bad responses. I can't help but think about the 3 friends of Job, Bildad and Zophar and Eliphaz, and how they respond. And again, you got to give these guys credit. When they show up in Job's moment of suffering and hardship, they want to help initially. That's what they come to do. And then 30 chapters later, they're just saying all sorts of things. And I think sometimes in our rush to speak, we live in a very fast-paced world. We can get our thoughts out right away. We want to say something quotable or tweetable. We might fall into the same trap of those 3 men. And I mean, you read their speeches, they're elegant, often sound in theology, referencing other parts of the Old Testament, or other parts of the Old Testament and even the New later reference them. I mean, their theology, at least in part, some of the whole principle of retribution stuff is off, but you know what I mean overall. They love God. They're educated and smart men. They're completely wrong about Job. And sometimes when we want to help people, we make similar mistakes. So I guess I just want us to talk through a little bit. How do we avoid making that mistake, or the mistakes of Job's friends? What do we learn from them about how we should come near to people in tragedy and be there, but not allow ourselves to be talked into trouble? And maybe we'll start with Chance on that.
Yeah. So there's some good things to learn from these guys, right? That they recognize his tragedy, they recognize his suffering, and they want to be present with him because there's friends. They care about him. So they show up. If I remember correctly, they rend their garments and they weep with him and they sit down with him for 7 days just in silence, because he's experienced so much tragedy and so much personal suffering. He doesn't even look like himself anymore. And so they just sit down with him in silence for 7 days. And I think sometimes that's the best thing that we can do, is just be physically present in the life of people who are suffering and who are in tragedy. But you learn from these friends that there's, on one hand and one side, good and helpful comfort. And then if you're not careful, you learn on the other hand that there's also something as miserable comfort, as they're called later in Job 16:2. He calls them miserable comforters. They attempted comfort, but they just made things worse and compounded the tragedy. And sometimes I think we can do the same just by thinking that we have to have something to say. We have to have words to answer this. We have to have something that will help. And just that feeling of I have to say something, we just start talking, and it just can compound the tragedy and compound the suffering instead of making it worse. And, you know, people have unfortunately made this basically the same argument that Job's friends made. They're like, Job, you must have done something terrible, and God must be bringing this suffering and bringing some condemnation against you because of that. And unfortunately, that's still sometimes people's response to tragedy. You step to their bedside in the hospital, or you find them in their midst of suffering, and the accusation is, well, you must be a worse sinner than everyone else. You know, Jesus dealt with that even in Luke 13, and he talked about how Pilate mingled the blood of the Galileans who came to make offering, and the tower in Siloam falls on people, and Jesus asked, do you suppose that they were worse sinners? And Jesus' answer in both of those is an emphatic no. Jesus said, no, they were not. This is not because of some sin that they've committed and they're worse sinners than everybody else and therefore tragedy. And so we've got to be careful not to make that same accusation against people and put that weight on their shoulders too.
Yeah, Chance, I think even about John 9, where they're like, hey, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And so
Absolutely.
this is an old idea, and we'll end on a question that deals with this more acutely about practical do's and don'ts. But I've even heard people, not with the whole you sinned idea, but even trying to spin it positively. Somebody's child dies or something, and they're like, well, they're an angel now, and God needed this, and God wanted them more than you. And like, just let Hallmark do your talking. If you're going to say anything, send a card, let Hallmark do your talking, and just leave it at that sometimes. Because in trying to be, most people that are suffering aren't going to remember anything you say anyway, unless it's bad. They'll remember that you were there, though. Job's friends come from a long way to be present. And they don't say for 7 days, they just sit down and weep with their friend. And that meant a lot to Job, I'm sure. Job starts talking and they start trying to correct him. Brent Strawn, in his book, Lies My Preacher Told Me, says something like, don't talk theology in the ICU. It's not a good idea because people don't need your exegesis. They don't want to know what the original languages say. They don't want to know what you think about Psalms of Lament. They're hurting. They're going to say things that don't make sense. And you might pour salt in their wounds by trying to be theologically astute in that moment. Not saying abandon your belief in God and confidence and hope, but people probably just need your compassion and not your counsel in that moment. And Job's friends could have helped if they learned that lesson.
Yeah. I'll share, Philip Yancey has a really good book, The Question That Never Goes Away. It's a second book that he wrote about suffering and the question of why. The first one was, where's God when it hurts? But in the second one, he says, I've adopted a 2-part test I keep in mind before offering counsel to a suffering person. First, he says, I ask myself how those words would sound to a mother who kissed her daughter goodbye as she put her on the school bus and then later that day was called to identify her bloody body. Would my words bring comfort or compound the pain? Then I ask myself, what would Jesus say to that mother? And then he says, few theological explanations pass those tests. The only way I know to respond with comfort and healing as Jesus did is to fully embrace the mother's grief and assure her that God feels more grief than she does. I don't know. I underlined that, put an asterisk beside it, put this in the margin, underlined it with a few exclamation points.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, show up. My mantra these days for most things is that action is better than inaction. I don't mean, unintentional action or action you haven't sort of planned a little bit, but in tragedy, so especially with personal tragedy, those of us who are the Job's friends to the one who is suffering to the Job, our inclination may be to stay home and just to pray for them privately, but never really reach out. And I don't know that that's always the best thing to do when you have a friend who is struggling. I think action is better than inaction. So maybe that means showing up. Maybe that means arranging a meal train. Maybe that means getting some money together for gas if you're making trips back and forth to the big city for hospital visits or whatever. But while I'm confident that action is better than inaction, I'm also confident that silence is better than just talking.
Yeah.
Talking out of your head. And, not only is this notion of like, well, the person died and now they're an angel. Not only is that biblically inaccurate. Okay, so quit talking about stuff you don't even know. People who die don't become angels. But the other piece of that is you're not helping anything. And I'm not saying that you can't show up and say words if you've never been through a situation that is similar to the one. And frankly, even if you've been through it, it'd probably still be better for you to be quiet because everybody grieves and deals with tragedy differently. And you need to acknowledge that. Job's friends were right in coming. Job's friends were wrong in opening their mouths. And you can say, I'm so sorry you're going through this. You can say, man, my heart hurts for you guys. And then you can say a prayer. And, hey, maybe then you just sit there. Or maybe then you just hug or, put your arm around them. Or maybe then you just leave. and they're going to know that you were there. And I think that's really all you need to do. It's all you can do.
I think the desire to talk in those situations is because we want to fix things.
Yeah.
And the thing that we have to understand is this: you're not going to fix a thing. There is only one fixer, and his name is Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And until you accept that, you're going to be a miserable comforter and just simply hurt with people and let Jesus be Jesus. Like, and don't turn the tragedy into your own and hijack it and make it about you. Let God be God. You just serve.
And don't speak for God. I mean, I remember like one of the hurricanes that came through New Orleans. Was that Katrina?
Yeah.
And I mean, it just devastated New Orleans. And then people, you get these hot take type people who start, post and post about, well, this is happening because of all the immorality in New Orleans. You don't know that. Quit speaking on behalf of God. New Orleans is not the modern day Sodom and Gomorrah. But even if it was, you wouldn't know if God did this or didn't do this. So don't try and put stuff in God's mouth either. If you're going to speak a word of comfort, speak the 23rd Psalm or something, and then pray and get out of there. That's what you need to do.
Eric Ortland, in his book, he has a more academic one, but on the one he did with Crossway, Suffering Wisely and Well, he says this about Job's friends. He says part of why they do the things they do and say the things they say is they really want to comfort themselves. Because if Job is truly suffering for no reason at all, then that means they're not off limits. And so to rationalize things for their own good, they have to convince themselves that there is a reason behind it. And as Brad mentioned, sometimes we're making ourselves the hero. We're thinking about ourselves, and we're really trying to comfort and soothe our own hearts about what could potentially be our own hardship one day. And so we just need to make sure that we go with the right intentions for the right purpose, and then do what we can and leave the rest to God, and realize you're not going to fix it in a day, in a week, in a month. We live in a fast-paced society. We want people to move on. Our culture is kind of situated this way, where there's this, you get your week of leave and then come back and get on with life. And it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Maybe I don't know, maybe even some of our culture is why we feel like we need to fill the silence. Like, we're just not comfortable with silence. We feel it with, you get in the car and the radio's on, or a podcast like this is playing, right?
Wow.
And so there's
not in tragedy, but play this.
Just play it.
But we just feel every moment with some kind of sound. And so to step into somebody's life in a moment of tragedy where things are silent because of what they're going through, we just feel uncomfortable. And so in that uncomfortable state, instead of remaining silent, we just let the word vomit come out. And we've just got to learn to be silent and to be comfortable in that period of silence when it's good and when it can be helpful and beneficial. As I think Robert was mentioning earlier, when you think about tragedy, yes, everybody experiences, but everybody experiences different. And so tragedy is both universal and unique, right? Tragedy comes to everyone's life, but everyone experiences it and processes it in a way that's unique to them. And so grief is universal. Everyone experiences grief, but they process it and work through it in a different way. And so the way I process grief and the way you guys process grief might be different. And so I might be in a stage of grief for much longer than someone else is. And so we just need to recognize that that's a part of the grieving process and the grieving cycle. And so the people that we are ministering to and comforting in their times of tragedy, even though we might have experienced something similar, I don't think we could ever say, I know exactly what you're going through, because your relationship with the person that you might have lost in life and the relationship with the person they lost in life, their relationship might have been completely different, although they were both spouses or both parents, or just the relationship is different. And so the way you process it is different. So we've got to understand that there's a uniqueness in everyone's approach to walking through their suffering and their tragedy, and just be willing to sit with them through that, listen, and then pray and address the needs that we can that come along.
Yeah, I think we've said a lot, and I think the Bible touches on this topic. You think about Moses in Numbers 20, and I know he disobeyed God in verses 7 through 12, but something that's not often thought about is how frustrating the Israelites were toward Moses. Miriam, his sister, had just died. And so there's a lot of frustration and grief with the mourning process going on. And that may have contributed to Moses's lashing out in a way that wasn't really typical of Moses in response to something that God commanded him to do. Now, God deals with them, and Psalm 106 speaks to that, but it just shows that we need to be compassionate. Maybe we've said all we can and need to say, but I guess in the final wrap up, are there any more practical do's and don'ts that you would say Christians should engage in and not engage in times of tragedy when we respond to these sorts of things? We'll just go around the horn here, start with Robert, then Brad, and then Chance. If there's anything practical, or maybe we've said all that needs to be said, any last minute nuggets you would say, do this when people are suffering, and maybe don't do that.
I would say first, while it's good to have tools in your toolbox, realize that, and to the point that's been made about grief and handling grief differently, you don't approach this with a cookie cutter template type mentality. The one default you'll always have is prayer, and I think maybe second to that is presence, being there. To the point we've made, silence I think is helpful. Listening, I think, is super helpful because they will show you the ways that you can support them. They will tell you the ways you can support them in that moment. So do they need food, or do they have so much food that they cannot close their refrigerator door? Do you need, is this a situation where maybe if you're a minister or a deacon, or I don't know, I guess you have to be a minister or a deacon, but do we need to orchestrate where all the elders just come over just to say, hey, we love you and we're praying for you right now? And elders may do that anyway. Maybe the elders come individually or whatever, but I mean, is any among you sick? Let him call the elders, James chapter 5 says. So if there's a situation like that, maybe that would be a good thing to do. But just listen, let the people sort of tell you what they need, and otherwise just be silent and pray with them and pray for them after the fact, and do your best in that moment.
Yeah.
I would say from a preaching standpoint, consistently teach through the Psalms, consistently preach through the Psalms, and show people, give them a grid for how things are to be understood biblically, so that when we get into these moments, the congregation kind of has an idea of how to respond. The person going through the tragedy can at least have another voice, another voice of reason in their head to combat some of the thoughts that come to us in the midst of grief. And so I would say some of the preventative things are very important in teaching people, because it's amazing to me in preaching Habakkuk or preaching the songs of lament, the amount of people who walk out and will say, I've never heard anything like that before. But it's right there. I mean, it's, how else do you explain what you're reading? And so I think we can do our part as preachers or teachers or elders or church leaders in just educating ourselves and people about just what the Bible says, and that it's okay to experience these wide range of emotions. But ultimately, I always go back to the one thing I tell myself whenever a tragedy hits is, let Jesus be Jesus. And that's my prayer. I want you to be you, and I want you to let me do whatever you want me to do. But don't try and fix, just let Jesus be Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's good. Chance?
No, I think Brad's right. Like, part of what's going to be beneficial for us as God's people is when we're not in the midst of suffering and tragedy, to give our attention to what the scriptures say about it, and to get a firm foundation, so that when it comes, that foundation is in place. We know where to lean. We know passages of scripture to turn to, and we have a good footing that's going to help us to minister to those in suffering, and it's going to help those who are facing that tragedy to be able to face it with confidence and trust that God and His grace is going to be sufficient. So, leaning on that picture, 2 Corinthians 12, Paul says, I'm praying about this. I've pleaded about it. And God said, my grace is sufficient. And knowing that His grace is multifaceted for every difficulty and every suffering of life. And Psalm 34:18 comes to mind, that God is near to the brokenhearted. And so he's not further from you in that tragedy. He's closer to you in that tragedy. And he's suffering right along with you.
Yeah. I would just say, as we close out, just maybe 3 brief things. One, God can handle your frustrations. You can pray your frustrations to God. Don't believe in just the Christian happy pill. The Christian life is a joyous life, but it is intermingled with hardship and suffering. Doesn't make you a bad Christian. It means you're human. Secondly, I would say, if it's your tragedy, remember to talk to yourself and not always listen to yourself. Talk to your heart. Your heart is a good student, but a bad teacher. And so Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, both times in verse 5 and 6, the psalmist talks to his heart. Why are you cast down on my soul? Why are you at trouble within me? Hope in God, reminding himself, as Robert was showing us with the 10th Psalm, that even in hardship, God is still good, no matter what's happening. And the third thing I would say is, just remember, no matter what the tragedy and suffering is, tragedy will not have the last word. Like, we sometimes get so used to it in our world, we just throw up our hands and maybe even nonchalantly think, well, that's just how it is. But it won't always be. Tolkien says, in the end, every sad thing will become untrue. And that's right, that things will be reversed and God is going to make things right. And that hope allows us to continue to press through in tragedy and not live with a constant dark cloud over us. And I think that's the Christian's response. Remain hopeful. And that draws people to Christianity when we have the hope that you couldn't have otherwise.
And maybe in our preaching, to the point Brad and Chance, and I hadn't gone down this road in my mind yet, but for this episode, but to emphasize the resurrection. I mean, we talk about the cross a lot, as we should. You can't overemphasize the cross, but sometimes I wonder whether we underemphasize the resurrection. And that was the point of hope that got those Christians through the difficulties when their tragedy was religious persecution. Something to think about there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we weren't sure we were going to go the full hour this time, but we did. So there we go. Oh, we of little faith. Why did we therefore doubt? Thanks for joining us for Four Preachers in a Podcast. Don't forget, you can find us every Friday, thelightnetwork.tv. Subscribe on YouTube. Stay cool.